Welcome to Top 10 Secret Channel. When night falls, darkness doesn't just bring silence and peace. It hides the most terrifying secrets. The screams in the dead of night, the whispers echoing in the shadows, the spine-chilling stories that make your blood run cold. Top 10 Screams in the Dark will take you into a world of eerie mysteries, supernatural horrors, and restless spirits that refuse to fade away. Brace yourself, because once you listen, you may never escape the terrifying nightmares that follow. Turn on the lights, put on your headphones, but whatever you do, never look behind you. Story 1. The Curse of the Black Maw. Deep within the shadowed heart of Eldermoor Forest lay a forgotten village, shrouded in mist and whispers of dark legends. Eldermoor was a place where sunlight barely pierced the dense canopy of twisted branches, and the air carried the weight of centuries-old fear. The villagers lived in uneasy harmony with their surroundings, always careful to heed the ancient warnings passed down through generations. Chief among these was the tale of the Black Maw, a malevolent force said to reside within a cursed object, waiting to consume the unwary. Amelia, a young woman of 21, was known in Eldermoor for her adventurous spirit and a curiosity that often set her apart from others. Unlike most villagers who avoided the dense forest, speaking of old superstitions and unseen dangers, Amelia found solace in its quiet depths. Raised by her widowed father, a woodcutter with a deep reverence for the legends of Eldermoor, she had grown up hearing tales of curses and ancient evils, but never fully believed them. Her defiance of the village's fears often led her to explore forgotten corners of the forest, uncovering remnants of a long-lost past. While many admired her bravery, others whispered that her boldness would one day bring trouble to their already fragile community. While most villagers avoided the deeper parts of the forest, she was drawn to its mysteries. One fateful afternoon, while exploring the outskirts of a long-abandoned manor at the forest's edge, she stumbled upon an ornate mirror half buried in the undergrowth. The mirror was large, its frame crafted from tarnished silver intricately carved with writhing roots and clawed figures. Despite its age, the glass was pristine, reflecting Amelia's curious gaze with unsettling clarity. She felt an inexplicable pull toward it, as though the mirror were calling to her. Ignoring the prickling sensation of unease creeping up her spine, Amelia decided to bring the mirror home. She placed it in her bedroom, propped against the wall where moonlight would catch its surface. That night, as she prepared for bed, she noticed something peculiar. Her reflection seemed slightly delayed, moving just a fraction slower than she did. In the days that followed, Amelia's behavior began to change. Her once vibrant personality grew muted, and dark circles formed under her eyes. She spoke little, often staring into the mirror for hours on end. Villagers who visited her home reported feeling an oppressive atmosphere, as though the very air had grown heavier. One evening, Amelia's closest friend, Lydia, decided to confront her. "Amelia, you've been acting strangely ever since you brought that mirror back," Lydia said, her voice tinged with concern. "You need to get rid of it." Amelia turned to her friend, her expression vacant. "I can't," she whispered. "It shows me things I'm not supposed to see." When pressed, Amelia described how the mirror no longer reflected her room, but another place entirely. A vast black void filled with faint whispers and writhing shapes. At night, she claimed, the mirror spoke to her, its voice a chorus of overlapping tones urging her to come closer. Lydia, alarmed by her friend's descent into madness, attempted to remove the mirror herself. But as she reached for it, a wave of nausea overcame her, and she recoiled in horror. In the glass, she saw her own reflection, but it was not truly hers. The reflection's eyes were hollow, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, and skeletal hands clawed at the edges of the frame as though trying to break through. That night, Lydia's screams echoed through Eldermoor. The villagers found her the next morning, lifeless and contorted, her face frozen in an expression of unspeakable terror. Her eyes were gone, leaving behind empty sockets that seemed to weep black ichor. Amelia claimed she knew nothing of what had happened, but her hollow tone and distant gaze betrayed her. Fear spread through the village like wildfire, and whispers of the Black Maw resurfaced. Elders warned that the mirror must be destroyed, but no one dared approach it. As the weeks passed, the mirror's influence over Amelia grew stronger. Her physical appearance deteriorated. Her skin became pallid, and her hair lost its luster. At night, villagers reported hearing her screams, followed by low, guttural noises that seemed to emanate from her house. Inside her home, Amelia's world had transformed into a waking nightmare. The whispers from the mirror grew louder, forming words that promised power, knowledge, and eternal life. If only she would submit. Shadows writhed across the walls, taking on vaguely human forms that watched her every move. When she walked through her house, the floorboards creaked under unseen pressure, and cold drafts carried faint whispers that seemed to echo her thoughts. At times, the mirror's surface would ripple, revealing fleeting glimpses of a twisted dimension where skeletal figures toiled in agony, their hollow eyes fixed on Amelia as though pleading for release. When she tried to sleep, cold, skeletal hands reached out from the mirror, brushing against her face and pulling at her blankets, leaving her shivering and unable to rest. Objects in her home began to move on their own. Chairs dragged across the floor, books tumbled from shelves, and once, a candlestick was hurled across the room, shattering a window. Amelia felt as though the mirror's presence was invading every corner of her life, stripping away her sanity piece by piece. The whispers from the mirror grew louder, forming words that promised power, knowledge, and eternal life. If only she would submit. Shadows writhed across the walls, taking on vaguely human forms that watched her every move. When she tried to sleep, cold, skeletal hands reached out from the mirror, brushing against her face and pulling at her blankets. Desperate, Amelia sought the help of Father Elias, the village priest. Elias was an old man, well-versed in the legends of Eldermoor. He listened intently as Amelia confessed her ordeal, his face growing grimmer with each word. "The Black Maw is no mere legend," Elias said. "It is a hunger that devours souls. The mirror is its vessel, a gateway to its domain. You must resist its lure, or it will consume you." Elias performed a blessing on Amelia's home, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers. For a brief moment, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift, and Amelia felt a glimmer of hope. But that night, the mirror retaliated. The villagers awoke to the sound of shattering glass and unearthly screams emanating from Amelia's house. Those brave enough to investigate found the interior in ruins. Walls were scorched, furniture was overturned, and the air reeked of sulfur. Amelia was gone, but the mirror remained intact, its surface now pulsing with a faint, sinister light. Father Elias, determined to end the curse, gathered a group of men to destroy the mirror. Before setting out, Elias meticulously prepared for the perilous task. He spent hours poring over ancient texts, seeking any knowledge that might aid them. He armed each man with consecrated tools, hammers, axes, and daggers dipped in holy water. The group gathered in the chapel to pray, their voices trembling as they asked for divine protection. The weight of their mission was heavy, and fear etched itself on every face. Despite their resolve, doubt lingered in their hearts. Each man knew the mirror's power, and none could escape the nagging thought that they might not return. As they marched toward Amelia's house under the cover of darkness, an unnatural silence enveloped the village. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as though the world itself dreaded what was to come. Armed with hammers and axes, they descended upon the cursed object. But as the first blow struck the glass, the room was engulfed in darkness. The men's screams filled the air, mingling with the sound of bones snapping and flesh tearing. When the darkness receded, the mirror was gone, and so were the men. Months later, the village was abandoned. Eldermoor's streets fell silent, overgrown with moss and vines, as though the forest itself sought to reclaim it. Survivors of the curse scattered, carrying with them stories that twisted into legend. Some spoke of hearing whispers in the wind, voices calling them back to the ruins, promising answers or perhaps retribution. Those who tried to rebuild their lives elsewhere found no solace. They were plagued by nightmares of skeletal hands and a mirror's glinting surface. Over time, wandering bards and traders began to recount the tale of Eldermoor, embellishing it with each retelling. What started as a warning about a cursed mirror became a chilling parable about the dangers of curiosity and the price of defying ancient forces. Despite these tales, some ventured to the ruins, driven by morbid fascination or a desire to claim the mirror's alleged power. Few returned, and those who did spoke incoherently, their minds shattered. Eldermoor, now a ghostly scar on the map, became a forbidden destination, its legend drawing only the most reckless and desperate. The world moved on, but the curse of the Black Maw lingered, etched in whispers and shadows, waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to seek it out. Eldermoor became a desolate place, avoided by all who valued their lives. Yet, the legend of the Black Maw continued to spread, drawing the curiosity of outsiders. One such outsider was a scholar named Jonathan Harker, a man driven by an insatiable thirst for forbidden knowledge and the belief that every legend held a kernel of truth. Harker had spent years researching the myths surrounding Eldermoor, poring over faded manuscripts and interviewing wandering bards who spoke of the cursed village. His fascination with the mirror bordered on obsession, fueled by the promise of unlocking ancient secrets and a power few dared to comprehend. Harker's journey to the forsaken village was fraught with ominous signs. As he neared the forest, he noticed the sudden absence of birdsong, and the air grew colder with each step. Local townsfolk refused to speak with him, their faces pale at the mention of Eldermoor. Undeterred, Harker pressed on, his journal clutched tightly in his hands as he recorded every unsettling detail of the desolate landscape. When he finally reached the ruins of Amelia's home, a strange mix of awe and dread overcame him. The mirror stood untouched, its surface gleaming as though it had been waiting for him. As he gazed into its depths, he saw not his reflection, but a swirling void filled with writhing forms. Yet, instead of recoiling, Harker leaned closer, captivated by the dark whispers that began to fill his mind. He found it in the ruins of Amelia's home, its surface pristine and inviting. As he gazed into the glass, his reflection smiled, and he did not. Jonathan's journal was discovered years later, detailing his descent into madness. The final entry read, "The Maw is eternal. It watches, it waits, and it hungers. Soon I shall join it. The mirror's current whereabouts are unknown, but whispers persist of a cursed object that leaves a trail of death and despair in its wake. Those who encounter it are warned. Do not look too closely, for the Maw looks back. And when it does, it never lets go." Story 2. The Awakening of the Dark Entity. Rivermouth was once a prosperous city, known for its bustling marketplaces and cobblestone streets. The city's heart was a grand plaza surrounded by ornate buildings, each adorned with intricate carvings of mythical beasts and scenes of triumph from its storied past. Its skyline was defined by the towering spires of Gothic cathedrals, whose bells echoed daily to mark the passage of time. Rivermouth was a cultural hub, renowned for its annual festivals that drew visitors from far and wide. Musicians filled the streets with vibrant melodies, and artisans displayed their crafts in lively markets. The city's rich history included tales of heroic battles and alliances forged in blood, but also darker whispers of forbidden rituals and ancient curses. These contrasting elements painted Rivermouth as a place of wonder and unease, a city alive with both light and shadow. Its skyline was adorned with the spires of ancient churches, and its people thrived on trade and culture. But 10 years ago, something unspeakable happened. Something so horrifying that Rivermouth became a ghost town, abandoned and feared. The event was dubbed the Awakening of the Dark Entity, and it marked the city's descent into an abyss of terror. The story began in the heart of Rivermouth's Old Quarter, a district rich in history but veiled in mystery. Beneath the ruins of St. Gabriel's Cathedral, a team of archaeologists stumbled upon an ancient crypt during an excavation project. Among them was Dr. Gerald Hawthorne, a young and ambitious scholar obsessed with uncovering the city's forgotten past. The crypt's entrance was sealed by a massive stone door, engraved with grotesque symbols and warnings in an ancient language. The symbols depicted snarling beasts intertwined with serpentine tendrils, their eyes seeming to follow anyone who dared approach. Each marking seemed to pulsate faintly, as if alive, and conveyed a chilling sense of foreboding. Ancient scholars believed these symbols were protective wards designed to trap malevolent forces within, while others interpreted them as curses upon those who might dare to breach the seal. The warnings, etched in jagged lines, hinted at unspeakable horrors and eternal torment for those foolish enough to ignore them. The carvings depicted twisted, screaming faces and serpentine tendrils coiled around a monstrous figure. Above the doorway, an inscription read, "Here lies the bound one. Disturb not the chains of shadow." Despite the ominous warning, Gerald's curiosity outweighed his caution. This could be the discovery of a lifetime, he whispered to himself as he ordered his team to break the seal. With heavy machinery and sheer determination, the door was forced open, revealing a stairway descending into darkness. As they ventured deeper, the air grew colder and heavier, carrying a faint metallic tang. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a chamber illuminated by faintly glowing runes etched into the walls. In the center of the room stood a black obelisk, its surface pulsating as if alive. Surrounding the obelisk were skeletal remains, their faces frozen in expressions of unimaginable agony. Gerald approached the obelisk, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch its surface. The moment his fingers made contact, the runes flared with blinding light, and a low, guttural growl reverberated through the chamber. The archaeologists screamed as the ground beneath them shook violently, and a crack appeared in the obelisk, releasing a plume of dark smoke that enveloped the room. The darkness spread like a living entity, consuming everything in its path. It twisted the environment, turning once vibrant streets into desolate wastelands. Trees withered and crumbled to ash, their leaves disintegrating midair. Buildings groaned as their walls cracked and collapsed under the weight of an unseen force. The air became suffocating, filled with an acrid stench of decay that burned the lungs of those who dared to breathe. Those who witnessed it felt their sanity slipping, their minds assaulted by visions of writhing, shadowy figures and whispers promising eternal torment. The darkness wasn't just a physical force, it was a psychological plague, feeding on fear and despair, leaving its victims hollow shells of their former selves. The smoke twisted and coalesced into a monstrous figure, a towering being of exposed bone, pulsating organs, and sinewy tendrils. Its eyes burned like molten fire, and its voice echoed with the cries of countless tormented souls. "You have freed me," the entity bellowed, its voice shaking the very foundation of the crypt. "For centuries I have waited. Now I shall feast upon this world." The archaeologists fled in terror, but Gerald remained frozen in place, his eyes locked on the entity. A tendril shot out from the creature and wrapped around him, pulling him closer. His screams echoed through the chamber as his body was twisted and reshaped, merging with the entity's grotesque form. When it was over, Gerald's face remained visible, contorted in eternal agony as part of the creature's chest. The entity emerged from the crypt, its presence plunging Rivermouth into chaos. Shadows spread across the city like ink spilling over a canvas, extinguishing light and life wherever they touched. People ran through the streets, their screams filling the air as the darkness consumed them. Those who were caught were either killed outright or transformed into grotesque, mindless servants of the entity. Amidst the carnage, a small group of survivors banded together. They were an unlikely mix: a priest, a former soldier, a young mother, and a street urchin. Father Matthias, the priest, believed the entity could be stopped if they found and destroyed its source of power. "The obelisk," Matthias said, his voice shaking. "It's the anchor that binds it to this world. We must destroy it." The group ventured into the heart of the darkness, navigating the ruined streets and avoiding the entity's minions. They witnessed unspeakable horrors along the way. Friends and family members twisted into monstrous forms, their bodies used as vessels for the entity's will. The city itself seemed alive, its buildings groaning and shifting as if in pain. The survivors reached the crypt, now a cavernous maw pulsing with malevolent energy. The journey there had been fraught with danger, each step more harrowing than the last. As they navigated the shattered streets of Rivermouth, they encountered twisted remnants of the city's past, buildings that seemed to breathe, their windows blinking like eyes, and alleyways that led to nowhere but endless shadows. Whispers filled the air, a cacophony of voices calling their names and promising salvation if only they would surrender. At one point, a swarm of grotesque creatures emerged from the darkness, their bodies a patchwork of human and beast, stitched together by sinewy tendrils. The group barely escaped, using makeshift weapons to fend off the relentless assault. The soldier, his hands shaking, muttered about how each creature bore the face of someone he had once known. The mother clutched her locket tightly, whispering prayers for her child as tears streamed down her face. The air grew heavier as they approached the crypt, a suffocating pressure that weighed down their every step. Strange symbols began to appear on the ground and walls, glowing faintly with a sickly green light. Each symbol pulsed in time with the survivors' racing hearts, as if alive and mocking their fear. By the time they stood before the crypt's entrance, their breaths came in ragged gasps, and their resolve was tested by the malevolent energy radiating from the darkened maw ahead. Inside, the entity awaited, its grotesque form larger and more horrifying than ever. Tendrils writhed around it, and the faces of its victims screamed silently from its flesh. "You cannot stop me," the entity roared. "Your world is mine." With trembling hands, Matthias held up a relic he had taken from the cathedral, a silver crucifix imbued with holy energy. "You were bound once," he said, "and you shall be bound again." The crucifix glowed as Matthias chanted a prayer, its light pushing back the darkness. The entity howled in rage, its tendrils lashing out, but the survivors fought back with everything they had. The soldier fired rounds into its core. The mother threw Molotov cocktails, and the urchin used a makeshift slingshot to hurl stones at its glowing eyes. As the crucifix's light intensified, the entity began to shrink, its form collapsing in on itself. With a final, deafening roar, it was pulled back into the obelisk, which shattered into pieces. The darkness receded, and for a moment, the city was silent. The survivors emerged from the crypt, their bodies battered but their spirits unbroken. Rivermouth was a ruin, its streets littered with the remnants of its former inhabitants. The survivors knew they could never rebuild what had been lost, but they had stopped the entity's spread, at least for now. But as they turned to leave, a faint whisper echoed through the air. It was Gerald's voice, distorted and broken. "You cannot contain me forever." In the ruins of the crypt, a single shard of the obelisk remained, pulsing faintly with dark energy. Days later, a scavenger, drawn by rumors of treasure in the ruins, stumbled upon the shard. As he reached for it, the shard seemed to call to him, whispering promises of power and riches. The moment his fingers touched its surface, a surge of darkness shot through him, and his scream echoed through the empty city. His eyes turned black, and his body began to twist, veins bulging and skin splitting as the shard's malevolence took hold. From that moment, the scavenger became its new vessel, wandering the land and spreading the shadow's influence to unsuspecting villages. The shard's curse had not ended. It had only begun anew, waiting for the perfect moment to awaken fully once more. The survivors did not see it as they left, but deep within the shard, the entity's malevolent eyes glowed. It was not defeated, only waiting. And so, the curse of Rivermouth endured, a chilling reminder that some doors should never be opened, and some evils can never truly be vanquished. Story 3. The Soul in the Darkness. The hill of St. Mortis was perpetually shrouded in a chilling fog, a murky veil hiding dark secrets beneath. Scattered across the hill were gnarled, ancient trees with twisted branches like ghostly hands clawing their way out of the earth. The wind howled through the rocky crevices, echoing like the sighs of trapped souls. At the base of the hill, a black, sluggish stream meandered, carrying an icy chill, and the elders of the village swore they had heard faint weeping rise from its depths on moonless nights. Atop this sinister hill stood the saint, and monastery, an ancient ruin seemingly forgotten by time. Villagers living at the base of the hill whispered eerie tales about the monastery, a place rumored to be cursed by a malevolent force. Yet no one truly knew what had transpired there, except for the priests and nuns who had vanished mysteriously over generations. Sister Maria was one of the youngest nuns to arrive at the monastery. She had been sent there after dedicating her life to God. With her pure heart and serene face, she believed this place would offer the peace she sought for her faith. However, from the moment she set foot in the monastery, unease settled in her heart. The wooden floorboards groaned under unseen footsteps in the dead of night, their echoes lingering as if someone was stealthily trailing her. Occasionally, Maria would hear faint whispers from somewhere far away. But when she stopped to listen, the silence that followed was suffocating. From within the shadows, she felt a cold, penetrating gaze, as if something unseen was scrutinizing her soul. A chill crept down her spine, enveloping her in a living darkness fraught with unseen perils. She tried to reassure herself that these sensations were mere figments of her imagination, born from unfamiliarity with her new surroundings. But on the third night, everything changed. That night, Maria was assigned to watch over the chapel. The chapel was vast, its cold stone walls adorned with solemn statues of saints that seemed to follow her every move. The flickering candlelight cast restless shadows on the walls, creating an illusion of imprisoned souls struggling to break free. While tidying the altar, Maria stumbled upon an old book hidden beneath the altar cloth. The book was bound in dark leather, its surface mottled with mold and cracks. Yet the strange symbols engraved on its cover captivated her. According to snippets of rumors Maria had overheard, the book was known as the Black Codex of the Damned, an ancient text said to contain the curses of a medieval sorcerer. It was whispered that the book had been burned multiple times, yet each time it mysteriously reappeared elsewhere, as if shielded by an unseen power. Villagers believed that anyone who opened the book would awaken cursed spirits and become bound to the curse forever. Although she could not decipher the language on its cover, an inexplicable force compelled her to open it. As the book was opened, a frigid gust swept through the room, even though every door was tightly shut. The pages were written in deep red ink, resembling blood, as if someone had poured their lifeblood into inscribing its curses. Maria managed to read a few words before a sharp, searing pain shot through her head. She collapsed to the ground, but before succumbing to darkness, she heard a sinister laugh emanating from the book. From that night onward, Maria was plagued by peculiar dreams. In them, she wandered a seemingly endless dark hallway where clawed hands reached out for her from both sides. Agonized screams and sorrowful cries echoed in the void, as though thousands of souls were being tormented. At the end of the hallway, she saw a woman clad in white robes. But as Maria approached, the woman's face distorted into a massive mouth lined with razor-sharp teeth. Maria woke drenched in sweat, but the fear lingered, unshakable. Unusual occurrences within the monastery began to escalate. The cold stone walls occasionally wept black liquid, resembling tar or blood. The chapel bell tolled in the dead of night, though no one had touched the rope. Nuns reported seeing shadowy figures wandering the garden, but when investigated, all that was found were footprints in the damp soil leading straight into the chapel's walls. At times, haunting hymns echoed from empty rooms, intermingled with mournful cries as if rising from the earth's depths. Candles flickered erratically before extinguishing abruptly as someone passed, leaving behind an oppressive darkness. Some nuns felt unseen hands brushing against their shoulders, while others claimed to see distorted faces faintly reflected in their mirrors each morning. One night, Maria decided to return to the chapel to confront the book. She believed it was the source of the haunting and sought to destroy it. But as she opened the chapel doors, the sight before her froze her in terror. Every saintly statue had been turned upside down, their faces twisted into grotesque, mocking smiles. On the altar, the book lay open, its pages flipping as if manipulated by an invisible hand. Maria stepped back, but the door behind her slammed shut, trapping her inside. From the book rose a swirling black mist that coalesced into the form of a monstrous entity. It was a towering figure with bat-like wings and eyes burning like embers. Its voice rumbled, deep and gravelly, like the chorus of 1,000 damned souls. "You have freed me, sister. Now you shall serve as my offering for liberation." Maria tried to flee, but the room seemed to have no exits. The entity lunged toward her, and darkness consumed everything. Her scream echoed through the monastery, waking every nun. But when they rushed to the chapel, everything was eerily still. There was no sign of Maria or the book. The monastery of St. Anne was abandoned shortly thereafter. The surviving nuns never returned to St. Mortis Hill. Some were so traumatized they became mute, sitting silently in corners with hollow gazes. Others left the church altogether, carrying with them an unshakable fear. They spoke of seeing Maria's twisted face in their dreams, her eyes pleading and her lips murmuring incomprehensible words. In the village, tales of the cursed monastery grew. Some claimed to see faint candlelight flickering within the ruins at night, while strange hymns wafted down from the hill, a reminder that evil still lingered. The legend of St. Anne Monastery became a warning. There are doors that must never be opened, and secrets that are better left buried in eternal darkness. Story 4. The Devil's Circus. Legends of the Devil's Circus have haunted the annals of history for centuries. This traveling nightmare, veiled in shadows and drenched in terror, is said to appear without warning in the dead of night, luring the curious and the unwary to their doom. Unlike any other carnival, it materializes in desolate fields and abandoned lands illuminated by crimson lights and whispered promises of wonders beyond imagination. Yet, by dawn, it vanishes, leaving behind only death, madness, and the faint stench of sulfur. At the heart of this sinister spectacle stands the ringmaster, a demonic clown known only as the infernal jester. His visage is the stuff of nightmares, horns spiraling grotesquely from his skull, a mouth filled with rows of needle-like teeth, and a forked tongue that slithers and writhes as he speaks. His eyes burn with malevolent glee, reflecting the countless souls he has claimed. It began, as these stories often do, with an ordinary town, Black Hollow, a sleepy hamlet nestled deep within the rolling hills of a nameless countryside. The people of Black Hollow were a superstitious lot, their lives governed by old tales and whispered warnings about the strange and unexplained. So, when a blood-red moon rose over the town one fateful night, unease rippled through the community like a chilling wind. By morning, rumors had spread of an unusual sight on the outskirts of town: a carnival. No one had seen it arrive. It was simply there, perched atop the withering fields, its towering tents and grotesque banners silhouetted against the gray sky. The air around it shimmered with an unnatural heat, and the faint sound of calliope music drifted on the breeze. Despite their apprehension, curiosity soon overcame caution. By midday, a crowd had gathered at the carnival's gates, their faces a mix of trepidation and eager curiosity. Mothers clutched their children's hands tightly, casting nervous glances at the towering skull-shaped archway that seemed to leer down at them. The elders whispered among themselves, their weathered faces pale with unease as they muttered old superstitions about things best left undisturbed. Yet the younger villagers laughed nervously, their excitement overriding any sense of dread. Each step closer to the gate was accompanied by an almost imperceptible tightening of the air, as if the very atmosphere resisted their approach. A low hum, just on the edge of hearing, seemed to emanate from the crimson glow of the archway, pulling them forward despite their mounting fear. The entrance was a massive archway shaped like a grinning skull, its eyes glowing with an eerie red light. Above it hung a wooden sign painted in dripping crimson. "Welcome to the Devil's Circus. Dare to enter?" The townsfolk entered hesitantly, their apprehension quickly replaced by awe as they took in the sights. The carnival was a riot of color and sound, jugglers tossing flaming skulls, acrobats twisting in impossible contortions, and freakish creatures prowling the grounds, half hidden in shadows. Yet, beneath the surface of wonder lay an undercurrent of dread. Children giggled nervously as they watched a fortune teller, a woman with no eyes and a mouth sewn shut, gestured to the cards she laid out before them. Her hands moved with unsettling precision, flipping over cards that depicted macabre images. A tower engulfed in flames, a skeletal figure clutching an hourglass, and a twisted jester wielding a bloodied scepter. The children's laughter faltered as her sewn lips twitched, emitting faint, rasping noises that seemed to form words in their minds. One child backed away, trembling, as the final card revealed a mirror fractured by a single drop of blood. "Your reflection," a voice whispered in their thoughts, "will be the last thing you see." Adults whispered uneasily about the Ferris wheel, which seemed to rise endlessly into the sky, its seats occupied by shadowy figures that never disembarked. And then there were the games. Carnival booths lined with prizes that seemed to pulse and writhe as though alive. In the center of it all stood the Grand Pavilion, a massive tent striped in black and crimson. From within came the faint sounds of applause and laughter. But it was a laughter that felt wrong, too sharp and too loud, echoing with a sinister edge. It was here that the townsfolk would witness the main event. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the calliope music grew louder, and the carnival's lights blazed brighter, bathing the grounds in an unholy red glow. Inside the Grand Pavilion, the townsfolk gathered, their excitement tinged with unease. The seats were arranged in a perfect circle around a raised stage, where a spotlight now shone on an empty podium. The music reached a fever pitch and abruptly stopped, plunging the tent into silence. A moment later, the infernal jester appeared. He seemed to materialize out of the shadows, his twisted form framed by the flickering light of torches. His voice boomed across the tent, smooth and oily, dripping with mockery and malice. "Welcome, welcome," he crooned, spreading his clawed hands. "Dear guests, tonight you are in for a treat, a spectacle unlike any you have ever seen. But be warned, what you see cannot be unseen, and the price of admission is higher than you think." The audience's uneasy murmurs were cut short as the ringmaster snapped his fingers. The stage erupted in flames, revealing a cage of writhing bodies. Inside were people, or what remained of them, contorted into grotesque shapes, their faces twisted in expressions of eternal torment. "And now," the ringmaster purred, "let the show begin." One by one, the acts unfolded, each more horrifying than the last. A tightrope walker balanced on a strand of barbed wire, her feet leaving bloody prints with every step. A magician performed a disappearing act, only for the volunteer to reappear moments later, screaming as their body dissolved into a swarm of locusts. The final act featured a carousel of skeletal horses that came to life, galloping through the crowd and dragging screaming victims back to the stage. The audience's initial fascination gave way to panic as they realized they were not merely spectators, but participants. The change began subtly. The air inside the tent grew heavier, suffocating, and the cheerful lights dimmed to an ominous crimson. A mother reached for her child's hand, only to find it ice cold and unresponsive, their eyes fixed on the stage as though in a trance. Whispers spread like wildfire among the crowd, murmurs of disbelief turning into cries of alarm as the reality set in. When one man tried to bolt for the exit, he was thrown back by an unseen force, landing in a heap with his screams echoing through the pavilion. Another woman clawed at the walls of the tent, her nails breaking as she desperately sought a way out, only to freeze when the ringmaster's booming laughter filled the space, rooting everyone in place with a paralyzing dread. Those who tried to flee found the tent's entrance barred by an invisible force. The ringmaster laughed, his voice echoing like thunder. "There is no escape," he sneered. "You entered of your own free will. Now you belong to the circus." By dawn, the Devil's Circus was gone. The withering fields were empty, save for the trampled grass and a few discarded remnants. A clown's mask smeared with blood, a twisted Ferris wheel spoke, and a charred tent pole. Of the townsfolk who had entered the carnival, none remained. Stories spread quickly through neighboring villages, carried by those who had seen the infernal lights from afar but dared not approach. Some spoke of the eerie glow casting grotesque shadows across the fields, while others claimed to hear faint, mocking laughter carried on the wind. Over time, the tales grew in detail and terror. They described the haunting strains of calliope music, the anguished cries of lost souls, and the ghastly visage of the infernal jester. Elders in the villages turned the circus into a cautionary tale, warning children to heed their words and avoid forbidden places. Yet, for every soul the stories frightened away, there were always a few driven by curiosity or hubris, convinced the legend was an exaggeration. Those who ventured too close to the withering fields rarely returned, and if they did, they came back hollow-eyed and mute, forever haunted by what they had seen. Over generations, the Devil's Circus became less of a legend and more of a grim inevitability, whispered about in hushed tones and never forgotten. They spoke of the Devil's Circus as a curse, a punishment for those who succumbed to temptation and ignored the warnings of old. Yet, despite the fear it inspired, the carnival continued to appear. Some claimed it was drawn to greed and sin. Others believed it sought to feed on fear and despair. Whatever its purpose, one thing was certain. the Devil's Circus would return. Years later, a lone wanderer stumbled upon the withering fields on a moonless night. He was a storyteller, a man who had spent his life chasing legends and uncovering the truths hidden within them. When he saw the carnival's crimson lights flickering in the distance, he felt a chill of both fear and excitement. Against his better judgment, he entered. The air inside the carnival was thick, suffocating, as though it clung to his skin. The vibrant colors of the tents seemed to bleed into one another, creating an unsettling, dreamlike haze. He passed a carousel where the horses' eyes followed him, their jaws snapping open and closed as if trying to speak. The calliope music distorted, the cheerful notes warping into discordant wails that made his head throb. He ventured deeper, finding himself in front of a hall of mirrors. Each reflection was wrong, a version of himself with sunken eyes, twisted features, and a mouth that opened unnaturally wide in a silent scream. As he stumbled back, the infernal jester appeared behind him in the glass, grinning wickedly. "Welcome to the grand finale," the jester hissed, his voice reverberating through the mirrors. The wanderer tried to run, but the ground beneath him seemed to shift and ripple like liquid. Hands emerged from the earth, skeletal and clawed, pulling him down as he screamed. The last thing he saw was the jester's grotesque face looming above him, laughing as the world dissolved into darkness. He was never seen again. But his journal was found, abandoned on the edge of the fields. Its final entry read, "The ringmaster's eyes are upon me. I can hear the laughter, and I know it's too late. To anyone who reads this, beware the Devil's Circus. Its price is your soul, and once you enter, there is no turning back." To this day, the Devil's Circus remains a phantom, a specter that haunts the edges of human imagination. Its lights are said to flicker in the darkest corners of the world, a reminder that some invitations should never be accepted. And if you should ever hear the distant strains of calliope music on a windless night, remember this: don't look back, for the infernal jester is always watching and he's always hungry. Story 5. The Reaper in the Tattered Cloak. The village of Hollowvale was nestled in a valley perpetually cloaked by mist. Surrounded by gnarled forests and barren fields, it was a place of isolation and whispered fears. Hollowvale was not marked on any map. Travelers avoided it, and its people lived under the shadow of an ancient curse. That curse had a name: the Reaper in the Tattered Cloak. Generations of villagers passed down the chilling tale, each retelling adding new layers of horror. The oldest record spoke of a bitter winter, centuries ago, when the first sighting of the Reaper occurred. A traveling merchant, lost in the forest, stumbled upon the cursed altar and attempted to plunder the strange artifacts surrounding it. By the time he returned to Hollowvale, his mind was fractured, his body gaunt and trembling. He spoke of a figure with glowing eyes that had whispered secrets to him, promising untold riches in exchange for a blood pact. The villagers dismissed him as mad until the next morning, when his body was found hanging from a tree, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the ground despite the overcast sky. Over the years, farmers reported their livestock disappearing, their barns collapsing under invisible weight, and strange symbols appearing overnight on their doors. The stories of those who vanished in the forest without a trace added to the dread, cementing the Reaper's legend as a specter of judgment, punishing greed and hubris. The Reaper was said to be a figure clad in a ragged cloak, his face a skeletal visage with glowing yellow eyes that pierced through the darkness. He was no ordinary specter, but the restless spirit of a sorcerer condemned to eternal torment after dabbling in forbidden necromancy. The legend warned that the Reaper emerged once every century when the moonless night coincided with the season of harvest, claiming the souls of those who dared to disturb his cursed land. For decades, Hollow Vale lived in uneasy silence, hoping the Reaper was nothing more than a myth. But all myths are rooted in truth. The fateful night began with a storm. The wind howled like the screams of the damned, and the forest trees groaned under its fury. Ethan, a young hunter and one of the few skeptics in the village, dismissed the old tales. He laughed at the fearful whispers of his neighbors, but deep inside, a seed of unease had taken root. Earlier that day, he had ventured deep into the forest to set traps. Though the woods were eerily quiet, his pride overruled his instincts. As he prepared to return, he noticed something unusual, a single path overgrown with thorny vines that hadn't been there before. Curiosity got the better of him, and he followed it. What Ethan found froze him in place. A circle of dead trees surrounded a blackened altar, its surface etched with runes that seemed to writhe and shift. Above it stood a figure draped in tattered cloth, its skeletal face illuminated by an unnatural glow. The Reaper. The figure turned toward Ethan, its hollow eyes locking onto him. A guttural voice echoed in his mind, speaking words he could not understand, but which filled him with a dread so profound that he stumbled backward. As Ethan fled, the sound of raspy, mocking laughter pursued him, mingling with the storm's wail. By the time Ethan returned to Hollow Vale, the storm had engulfed the village. The once familiar path home had transformed into a twisted nightmare. The trees along the road seemed alive, their branches clawing at him as if trying to drag him back into the forest. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and faint whispers echoed around him, growing louder with every step. Shadows darted through the mist, their forms indistinct but unmistakably human-like, as if spirits of the forest's victims were watching his every move. When the village finally came into view, Ethan noticed something chilling. The lanterns that normally glowed warmly in the windows were all extinguished, and the streets were eerily silent except for the faint sound of footsteps. His own, or perhaps something following close behind. His heart pounded as he sprinted the last stretch, the tavern's door swinging open with a creak just as the storm's fury reached its peak. He burst into the tavern, his face pale and eyes wild. Between gasps, he recounted what he had seen. The villagers listened in horrified silence, their worst fears confirmed. The Reaper had returned. Before they could decide on a plan, the first sign of the curse revealed itself. The tavern's hearth, which had burned steadily for hours, suddenly extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. When the villagers lit a lantern, they found scratch marks on the wooden floor, long, jagged lines leading toward the door. That night, screams echoed through Hollow Vale. Families barricaded themselves indoors, their hearts pounding as the storm outside seemed to grow in intensity. Children clung to their parents, their wide eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. The sound of faint scratching at the windows sent shivers through the households, and some swore they could hear guttural whispers, as though the Reaper was just outside, calling their names. Doors creaked ominously despite being tightly bolted, and shadows danced unnaturally across the walls. One family reported hearing heavy, deliberate footsteps on their roof, followed by the sound of slow, deliberate tapping on the chimney. No locks or prayers could keep the Reaper at bay, and the sense of dread grew heavier with each passing moment. The night stretched on endlessly, punctuated by distant screams and the occasional haunting laughter that seemed to echo through the mist. The mist grew thicker, and shadows slithered through the village like living things. Those who ventured outside were never seen again. By dawn, only silence remained, broken by the occasional creak of empty homes. Ethan and a small group of survivors gathered in the church, the oldest building in Hollow Vale and the only place untouched by the creeping shadows. Father Aldrich, the village priest, claimed that the church's consecrated ground could offer temporary refuge. But even he looked uncertain as the storm rattled the stained glass windows. "We cannot hide forever," Aldrich said, gripping his rosary tightly. "The Reaper is bound to this land, but his power comes from his altar. If we destroy it, we may banish him back to the void." The villagers hesitated, but desperation outweighed their fear. Armed with torches, axes, and Aldrich's blessings, they ventured into the forest, following Ethan's description of the cursed path. The journey was treacherous. As the group pressed deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, their breath misting in front of them despite the storm. The trees seemed to move, their gnarled branches stretching toward the villagers like grasping fingers. At one point, a piercing scream rang out, but it came from no visible source, sending chills down their spines. The ground beneath their feet became soft and unstable, as though it were breathing, and more than once, someone stumbled into a hidden pit filled with rotting leaves and skeletal remains. Whispers surrounded them, each voice distinct yet overlapping, some pleading for help while others taunted their efforts. At the edge of their vision, they caught glimpses of figures darting between the trees, always just out of reach but close enough to unsettle them. A sickly green mist began to rise from the ground, curling around their legs like serpents, further clouding their sense of direction and making every step a test of their courage. The trees seemed to shift, closing in around them, and whispers filled the air, each voice a plea for help or a chilling threat. When they reached the altar, the Reaper was waiting. He stood motionless, as if expecting them, his bony fingers curled around a staff of gnarled wood. Without warning, he raised the staff, and the shadows around him erupted into monstrous forms, twisted creatures with glowing eyes and clawed hands. The villagers fought valiantly, but the shadows were relentless. Ethan swung his axe, severing one creature's arm, only to watch it regenerate moments later. Aldrich recited prayers, his voice growing hoarse, as the holy light from his rosary pushed back the darkness. Finally, Ethan reached the altar. With a primal roar, he smashed it with his axe, the runes shattering like glass. The Reaper let out an unearthly scream, his form dissolving into a storm of ash. The shadows vanished, and the forest fell silent. The survivors returned to Hollowvale, battered but alive. For the first time in years, sunlight broke through the mist, casting the village in a golden glow. They believed they had won, that the curse had been lifted. But victory came at a price. Ethan was never the same. He spoke of the Reaper's voice still echoing in his mind, promising vengeance. Over time, he grew distant, his eyes haunted by something unseen. One night he disappeared, leaving behind only a single message scrawled on the church's wall. He will return. Decades later, Hollowvale remains abandoned. Yet, its legacy endures in the tales of those who dared to venture into its forsaken boundaries. A pair of wandering merchants seeking shelter during a storm stumbled upon the village and described an eerie silence that seemed alive, as if the air itself was watching them. They claimed to see shadows moving independently of any light source, whispering unintelligible words that echoed in their minds long after they fled. Another account came from a group of thrill-seeking explorers who entered Hollowvale armed with lanterns and bravado. Only one returned, muttering incoherently about eyes in the mist and hands reaching from the earth. His hair had turned stark white, and he refused to speak of what he had seen. Over time, Hollowvale became a forbidden destination, drawing the curious and the desperate, but none who entered stayed unmarked by its curse. The Reaper's presence lingered, a chilling reminder that some places are best left undisturbed. Travelers who pass through the valley speak of an oppressive silence and a chilling presence that watches from the shadows. Some claim to hear the faint sound of laughter, while others report seeing a figure in a tattered cloak standing among the trees. The Reaper's legend endures, a warning etched into the land itself. And on moonless nights, when the mist grows thick and the wind carries whispers through the trees, the villagers of nearby towns lock their doors and pray. For they know that the Reaper is always watching, waiting for the day his curse will rise again. And when it does, no soul will be spared. Story 6. The Chains of the Revenant Dark Moor was a village forgotten by time, hidden deep within a valley surrounded by dense, ancient forests. The air was heavy with mist, and the trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Few dared to tread the paths that led to Darkmoor, for it was a place steeped in dread, haunted by a shadowy legend whispered across generations. The Revenant of Chains. The legend spoke of a monstrous figure draped in tattered rags, its skeletal frame wrapped in heavy, rusted chains. It was said that during the darkest winters, entire villages near Darkmoor would vanish overnight, their homes left untouched but eerily silent, with only faint scratch marks and deep grooves in the ground hinting at their fate. Traders who braved the forest paths recounted sightings of a gaunt, towering figure dragging chains that glowed faintly in the moonlight. One tale told of a peddler who had sought refuge in an abandoned cabin, only to find himself awoken by the clinking of chains and a whispering voice promising eternal torment. When he fled at dawn, he discovered the cabin had been reduced to ashes, with no sign of fire having touched the surrounding forest. These accounts, passed down and embellished through the years, cemented the Revenant's reputation as a harbinger of doom, a cursed wraith bound to bring despair to all who dared disturb his domain. Once a powerful sorcerer who used forbidden magic to cheat death, the Revenant was cursed by vengeful spirits to an eternity of torment. The chains, forged from the iron of a cursed altar, bound his soul to the mortal plane, ensuring his agony would never cease. Yet the curse also made him a harbinger of doom, for those who heard the clinking of his chains would soon find their lives consumed by darkness. For decades, Darkmoor lived in uneasy peace, the legend of the Revenant a cautionary tale to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. But legends, as the villagers would soon discover, are rarely just stories. It began with a storm. On a moonless night, a violent tempest swept through the valley, uprooting trees and flooding the fields. The villagers huddled in their homes, praying for the storm to pass. But as the wind howled and the rain lashed against their windows, some claimed to hear another sound beneath the cacophony, the slow, deliberate clinking of chains. By morning, the storm had passed, but the village was not unscathed. Fields lay in ruins, livestock had vanished, and strange symbols were etched into the muddy ground. The symbols, intricate and otherworldly, seemed to radiate an unnatural cold. The villagers tried to dismiss them as tricks of the storm, but an unshakable sense of unease settled over Darkmoor. Some gathered in the village square, debating whether the symbols were a warning or a curse. Elder Rowan suggested that the strange markings resembled ancient warding runes, their purpose long forgotten but now corrupted. Others, in a panic, attempted to protect their homes by scrawling crude charms on their doorways and burning sage in their hearths. A group of desperate mothers led their children to the church, where they begged Father Elias to perform a blessing over the village. Despite the priest's reassurances, fear continued to spread like wildfire, with whispers of doom echoing through every home. The symbols seemed to glow faintly at night, as if alive, and those who gazed at them too long reported hearing faint, ghostly murmurs that lingered in their minds. The following night, the first disappearance occurred. Liam, a boy of 10 years with an insatiable curiosity, had ventured to the edge of the forest against his parents' stern warnings. He carried a small lantern, its flickering light barely penetrating the oppressive darkness that seemed to thicken as he approached the tree line. Liam's heart raced with equal parts fear and excitement as he followed faint scratches on the ground, marks he convinced himself were left by a stray animal. As he neared a hollow tree, he heard the faintest sound of chains clinking, a rhythmic and deliberate noise that sent a chill up his spine. Turning his lantern toward the sound, he saw a shadowy figure in the distance, impossibly tall and draped in tattered rags, its skeletal frame barely visible through the mist. Paralyzed by terror, Liam couldn't move as the figure began to glide toward him, the chains dragging behind it with a sickening scrape. The boy dropped his lantern, its fragile glass shattering and extinguishing the light. His scream was swallowed by the forest as the shadow engulfed him, leaving behind only the faint echo of rattling chains and the disturbed earth where he had stood. A young boy named Liam, known for his curiosity, failed to return home after venturing near the forest's edge. His parents searched frantically, their calls echoing into the silent night. When dawn broke, all they found was a trail of disturbed earth leading into the forest, as though something had been dragged away. The disappearances continued. Each night, another villager vanished, leaving behind only faint traces. Scratch marks on doors, deep grooves in the dirt, and the ever-present sound of chains rattling in the distance. The villagers' fear grew palpable, and whispers of the revenant spread like wildfire. Elder Rowan, the village's oldest resident, claimed to know the truth. "The revenant has awakened," he warned, his voice trembling. "The storm disturbed his prison, and now he roams once more, seeking vengeance." According to Rowan, the revenant's power was tied to an ancient altar deep within the forest. Centuries ago, the altar had been the site of a dark ritual performed by the sorcerer who would become the revenant. The villagers of that time had risen against him, chaining him to the altar and cursing him to eternal suffering. Yet, the altar remained a focal point of his power, and as long as it existed, the revenant could never be truly destroyed. Desperation drove the villagers to action. A small group of brave souls volunteered to venture into the forest and destroy the altar. Among them was Adrian, a blacksmith with a strong arm and an even stronger sense of duty. Alina, a healer with knowledge of ancient charms and wards. And Thomas, a hunter familiar with the forest's treacherous paths. The group set out at dusk, armed with torches, weapons, and a prayer. The forest loomed before them like a living entity, its shadows deep and impenetrable. As they entered, the air grew colder and the trees seemed to close in around them, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes that resembled clawed hands. The ground beneath their feet grew soft and damp, as though it were pulsing faintly, and the faint sound of whispering voices filled the air. Shadows darted just out of sight, flickering between the gnarled trunks as if watching their every move. At one point, a sudden piercing scream echoed through the forest, cutting through the silence and freezing the group in their tracks. Adrian gripped his hammer tightly, his knuckles white, as Alina whispered a prayer under her breath. The forest seemed alive, shifting and writhing as if trying to swallow them whole, and every step forward felt heavier, as though an unseen force was pushing back against them. The only sounds were their own footsteps and the faint, ever-present rattle of chains. The deeper they ventured, the more the forest seemed to resist them. Branches clawed at their clothing, and the ground became uneven and treacherous. At one point, they stumbled upon a clearing where dozens of crows perched silently, their eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. The birds watched the group pass, their heads turning in unison, but they made no sound. After hours of navigating the labyrinthine forest, the group reached the altar. It stood in a clearing surrounded by dead trees, their twisted branches reaching skyward like hands frozen in agony. The altar itself was a grotesque structure, carved from black stone and adorned with rusted chains. Symbols similar to those found in the village were etched into its surface, glowing faintly in the darkness. As they approached, the air grew heavier, pressing down on them like an invisible weight. And then, he appeared. The revenant emerged from the shadows, his form towering and grotesque. His skeletal frame was draped in tattered rags, and his chains dragged behind him, creating a cacophony of metallic clinks. His hollow eyes burned with a malevolent yellow light, and his voice, when he spoke, was a guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through their very bones. "You dare disturb my domain," he hissed, his words dripping with malice. "Your souls will join the others." The group barely had time to react before the revenant attacked. Chains sprang to life, lashing out like serpents, their rusted edges slicing through the air. Adrian swung his hammer, deflecting one chain, while Thomas loosed arrow after arrow, though they seemed to pass through the revenant as if he were made of smoke. Alina chanted a protective incantation, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. Realizing they could not defeat the revenant through brute force, Alina focused on the altar. "Destroy it!" she screamed, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "It's the source of his power." Adrian and Thomas turned their attention to the altar, but the revenant fought with renewed ferocity, his chains forming an impenetrable barrier. Desperation fueled their efforts. Adrian hurled his torch at the altar, the flames licking at the ancient stone but failing to catch. Thomas, his quiver nearly empty, aimed his final arrow at the glowing runes. The arrow struck true, and the runes flickered and dimmed. The revenant let out a deafening roar, his chains writhing as though in agony. Adrian seized the moment, raising his hammer and bringing it down with all his strength. The altar shattered, the chains binding it falling limp. The revenant's form began to dissolve, his skeletal frame crumbling into ash. "This is not the end," he rasped, his voice fading as the wind carried his remains into the night. "I will return." The survivors returned to Darkmoor, their bodies battered but their spirits unbroken. For the first time in years, the forest seemed less oppressive, and the faint light of dawn pierced through the mist. The villagers celebrated their victory, but their joy was tempered by the knowledge that the revenant's curse was not entirely broken. Adrian, Alina, and Thomas bore the scars of their encounter, both physical and mental. Adrian's hands trembled uncontrollably. Alina's once steady voice faltered during her chants, and Thomas refused to enter the forest ever again. Yet, they took solace in the fact that they had bought Darkmoor time. But the revenant's final words lingered in their minds, a chilling reminder that the curse of the chains was not so easily undone. Years passed, and Darkmoor slowly faded from memory. Yet, the whispers of its cursed past persisted, spreading through neighboring villages and beyond. Travelers who braved the valley spoke of an oppressive silence that seemed alive, as though the land itself were holding its breath. In the years following the village's abandonment, a merchant recounted hearing the faint clinking of chains as he crossed the forest, only to be chased by shadowy figures that dissolved into mist when he reached the clearing. Another tale told of a group of treasure hunters who ventured into Darkmoor's ruins, drawn by rumors of a cursed relic tied to the revenant's power. Only one returned, his face pale and his hair turned completely white. He spoke of eyes glowing in the darkness and a skeletal figure draped in chains, whispering his name in a voice that chilled his very soul. In neighboring villages, people claimed that on moonless nights, the wind carried not just the sound of rustling leaves, but faint, mournful wails and the ominous clink of iron chains. Elders warned children to stay indoors and never venture near Darkmoor's borders, their warnings laced with dread and conviction. These stories turned the revenant into a legend far more fearsome than a mere ghost. He was an eternal curse, bound to the land, waiting for the day when his chains would break and his wrath would consume all who dared disturb his domain. Travelers who stumbled upon the village's ruins spoke of an eerie silence and an unnatural chill in the air. Some claimed to hear the faint sound of chains rattling, growing louder as they approached the forest. Those brave enough to venture inside rarely returned, and the few who did spoke of glowing eyes watching from the shadows and whispers that promised eternal torment. Legends of the Revenant spread far and wide, a warning to those who sought to tamper with forces beyond their understanding. And on moonless nights, when the wind carries the faint clinking of chains, the people of neighboring villages lock their doors and pray. For they know that the Revenant's curse is eternal, and one day he will rise again. Story 7. The Puppet Master of Elder Gate. Elder Gate was once a shining jewel of prosperity, a bustling city filled with life and ambition. Its spires reached high into the heavens, its markets overflowed with treasures from across the lands, and its people lived with pride in their accomplishments. But hidden beneath the surface was a darkness, a rot that began with ambition and grew into a festering curse. Today, Eldergate lies in ruins, a haunted husk of its former glory, where only whispers of its grim fate remain. The city's name is now synonymous with terror, for it is said to be ruled by the Puppet Master, an ancient and malevolent force that ensnares the souls of all who dare enter its domain. The story of Eldergate's fall begins with greed. Centuries ago, the city's rulers sought to solidify their dominance over neighboring kingdoms. They summoned a sorcerer named Mordain, a figure shrouded in mystery and feared for his command of forbidden magics. Mordain promised the rulers untold power and prosperity in exchange for their trust. He demonstrated his abilities by summoning golden coins from thin air and causing them to multiply before their eyes, a feat that left the rulers awestruck. He turned barren fields into lush farmland overnight, and when the city faced a raid by neighboring forces, Mordain conjured an impenetrable barrier of shimmering threads that repelled the attackers without a single casualty. The rulers, dazzled by his prowess and eager to secure their dominance, saw him not as a threat, but as their greatest asset. His promises of a golden age seemed undeniable, and so they entrusted him with their city, blind to the darkness that lurked beneath his sorcery. Desperate to secure their reign, they agreed, but Mordain's promise came with a price. Using dark rituals, he forged a magical web that extended through the entire city, a network of invisible threads that connected every inhabitant. At first, the results were astonishing. The city's economy flourished, its defenses became impenetrable, and its leaders seemed invincible. Yet, as the years passed, the threads began to tighten. The people of Eldergate noticed strange changes. They became more compliant, their free will eroding as they moved and acted like marionettes under unseen control. Those who resisted were punished, their bodies twisted and contorted by the threads, leaving them as grotesque husks that still walked the streets. The rulers, blinded by their power, ignored the growing dread among their subjects. One fateful night, the city reached its breaking point. Mordain, drunk with power, unleashed his final ritual. Standing atop the grand spire, he summoned a colossal entity from the void, a shadowy, skeletal figure with massive hands from which thousands of shimmering threads cascaded. This was the true Puppet Master, an eternal being that Mordain had bound to the city. But the sorcerer's arrogance was his undoing. The Puppet Master turned on its summoner, binding Mordain with his own threads and twisting him into the first of its eternal puppets. From that moment, Eldergate became a city of the damned. Its people were stripped of their humanity, their bodies left to wander the streets as lifeless marionettes, while their souls were consumed by the Puppet Master. The city fell silent, its grand halls and vibrant markets reduced to empty husks. Eldergate became a ghostly ruin, avoided by all who valued their lives. Though Eldergate is abandoned, its legend persists. Travelers who stray too close to its borders report hearing eerie sounds: the faint creak of strings tightening, the dull clinking of skeletal limbs, and whispers that seem to come from the shadows themselves. One caravan leader recounted feeling an unnatural heaviness in the air, as though unseen hands were pressing down on him, while his horses refused to take another step forward. Another traveler described seeing vague, humanoid shapes in the distance, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if pulled along by invisible strings. A young adventurer who dared to cross the city's outer walls returned days later, muttering incoherently about a towering figure manipulating a web of threads, his own hands trembling as if bound by phantom strings. The stories differ in detail but share a chilling similarity: the sensation of being watched, judged, and almost claimed by an unseen force. Some claim to have seen the puppet master, a towering figure cloaked in darkness, its skeletal hands manipulating a web of threads that gleamed in the moonlight. Those who dare enter Eldergate's ruins rarely return, and the few who do are irrevocably changed. One such account came from a merchant named Darian, who ventured into Eldergate in search of forgotten treasures. When he returned, his once strong frame was gaunt, and his eyes were hollow. He spoke of streets filled with lifeless figures, their heads jerking unnaturally as if following his every move. In the city's center, he claimed to have seen the puppet master looming over a massive stage, its threads extending into the darkness. Darian's voice broke as he described the moment he realized that some of the figures on the stage were alive, their mouths open in silent screams as their bodies moved against their will. He died days later, his body found twisted and tangled in invisible strings. Among those drawn to Eldergate's sinister allure was Alice Greaves, a historian obsessed with uncovering the truth behind the city's fall. Alice's fascination with the cursed city stemmed from a childhood steeped in ghost stories and dark tales. Her grandmother, a survivor of a nearby village that had been plagued by the puppet master's influence, would recount horrifying tales of eerie lights and lifeless figures seen at the edge of Eldergate. These stories left an indelible mark on Alice, igniting a curiosity that grew into a full-blown obsession as she matured. Determined to separate fact from legend, Alice devoted her life to studying the arcane, combing through forbidden texts and lost records in search of answers. Her quest for knowledge was not merely academic. She believed that understanding the curse could help exorcise the darkness that haunted her family for generations. Armed with ancient maps and a collection of fragmented texts, Alice believed she could uncover the secrets of the puppet master and perhaps even put an end to its curse. Armed with ancient maps and a collection of fragmented texts, Alice believed she could uncover the secrets of the puppet master and perhaps even put an end to its curse. Alice's journey began with trepidation. As she crossed the threshold into Eldergate, the air grew cold and an oppressive silence enveloped her. The city's ruins loomed around her, their once grand architecture now twisted and decayed. Shadows seemed to move at the edges of her vision, and faint whispers tickled her ears, though she saw no one. She followed her map to the Grand Spire, the supposed site of Mordaine's final ritual. Along the way, she encountered the remnants of Eldergate's cursed inhabitants. They stood motionless in the streets, their skeletal frames bound by strings that stretched into the sky. When she approached, their heads jerked toward her, empty sockets seeming to watch her every move. Her heart pounded, but she pressed on, determined to reach the truth. The Grand Spire was the only structure that remained intact, its shadow stretching across the city like a harbinger of doom. As Alice entered its cavernous halls, she was struck by the sight of a massive stage at its center. Upon it stood hundreds of marionettes, their forms contorted and bound by the puppet master's threads. Above them loomed the puppet master itself, its skeletal hands manipulating the strings with a grotesque precision. Alice froze as the puppet master's hollow eyes turned toward her. Its voice, a low, resonant growl, echoed through the hall. "Another soul to join my collection," it intoned. Threads shot toward her, glimmering like spider silk in the dim light. Alice dodged, narrowly avoiding their grasp, and ran toward the stage, clutching a talisman she had brought for protection. Reciting an incantation she had found in her research, Alice hurled the talisman at the puppet master. The talisman, a small disc of obsidian etched with ancient symbols, had been unearthed in a crumbling archive during one of Alice's expeditions. Legends described it as a relic forged by the last survivors of Eldergate, imbued with their collective will to break the puppet master's curse. It was said to carry the power to sever the threads that bound the marionettes. As Alice invoked the incantation, her voice trembled, but the words rang with a strange resonance, as though the talisman itself amplified her intent. The air around her seemed to warp as the talisman flew through the air, its etched runes glowing fiercely. When it struck the puppet master, a blinding burst of energy erupted, illuminating the hall and momentarily dispelling the oppressive darkness. The air crackled with energy as the talisman exploded in a burst of light, severing some of the threads. The marionettes on the stage collapsed, their strings cut, but the puppet master remained. It let out a deafening roar, its skeletal form expanding as more threads erupted from its hands. Alice realized that the puppet master could not be destroyed through ordinary means. She climbed the stage, avoiding the thrashing threads, and reached the base of the spire where Mordane's ancient altar stood. The inscriptions on the altar glowed faintly, a remnant of the dark ritual that had summoned the puppet master. Summoning all her courage, Alice placed her hands on the altar and began to chant a counter-ritual she had memorized. The ground shook as the altar absorbed the energy of her words. The threads binding the marionettes snapped one by one, and the puppet master let out an ear-splitting scream. Its form began to disintegrate, the skeletal frame collapsing into ash. But as the last thread snapped, Alice felt something cold wrap around her wrist. Looking down, she saw a single thread, pulsing with dark energy, connecting her to the altar. The puppet master's voice echoed in her mind. "You have severed my strings, but the stage requires a master." Alice's vision blurred as the altar's power consumed her. The last thing she saw was the marionettes rising once more, their strings now extending from her hands. Eldergate remains a place of desolation, its cursed legacy unbroken. Travelers still speak of the puppet master, though now they describe a new figure. A woman with hollow eyes, her hands manipulating threads that control the city's restless dead. The legend warns all who approach. Eldergate's stage is eternal, and the puppet master's strings will always find a new host. Neighboring towns have adopted rituals to guard against the curse. In Ashbourne, villagers hang talismans made of silver threads at their doorways, believing they repel the puppet master's influence. In Ravencroft, residents avoid all forms of puppetry and refuse to entertain traveling performers, fearing they may be harbingers of the curse. On moonless nights, families gather around hearths, chanting old prayers handed down through generations to keep the darkness at bay. Some even claim that the faint sound of strings tightening can be heard in the wind if Eldergate's shadow is near, prompting entire towns to douse their lights and fall silent in hopes of remaining unnoticed. These precautions have become a way of life, a testament to the enduring fear of Eldergate's malevolent curse. And on moonless nights, when the wind carries the faint creak of strings and the whispers of the damned, the wise lock their doors and pray that they, too, do not become part of the puppet master's grim performance. Story 8. The bloodthirsty wail of Dracomire. The village of Dracomire rested in a desolate hollow, shrouded by a perpetual mist that veiled it from the outside world. Surrounded by the sinister forest of Velka and the churning, lifeless waters of the Blackmoor River, the villagers lived in a constant state of dread. Generations of isolation had turned Dracomire into a shadow of its former self, with its people whispering fearful prayers to ward off the darkness that lingered just beyond the tree line. Central to their fears was an ancient and terrible legend, the bloodthirsty whale. This was no ordinary myth. The bloodthirsty whale was said to be a monstrous, cursed entity, born of blood magic and old sorcery. Those who encountered it seldom survived, and those who did spoke of it in whispers, their eyes filled with unshakable horror. Its visage was described as skeletal and sinewy, its mouth filled with jagged, impossibly long fangs, and its eyes, if they could be called that, were empty voids that seemed to pull in the light itself. The creature emitted a wail so chilling, so otherworldly, that it could shatter the sanity of any who heard it. The villagers of Dracomire knew this curse all too well, for it was their ancestors who had brought it upon the land. Centuries ago, Dracomire had been a thriving settlement, a beacon of life and prosperity nestled against the Blackmoor River. Traders from distant lands brought vibrant fabrics, exotic spices, and rare artifacts to the bustling market square, where merchants haggled and children played under the watchful gaze of the town's clock tower. Festivals marked the changing of seasons, with the villagers gathering to feast, dance, and light lanterns that floated into the night sky like stars. At the heart of the village was the Great Hall, where Elder Magnus presided, a wise and respected leader known for his silver tongue and unyielding ambition. Dracomire's people were proud of their heritage, renowned for their intricate wood carvings and their mastery of river navigation. It was a place of community and hope, a stark contrast to the cursed shadow that would eventually consume it. Traders navigated the Blackmoor River, bringing wealth and prosperity to the village. The forests of Velka were teeming with game, and the fields yielded bountiful harvests. But such fortune attracted greed, and it was this greed that sealed the village's fate. The village elders, seeking eternal prosperity, sought out a coven of witches rumored to dwell deep within Velka. These witches, shunned by the outside world for their malevolent practices, agreed to help, for a price. The elders, blinded by ambition, offered a blood pact, sacrificing a group of outcasts from the village. The ritual performed was ancient and vile, summoning a spirit of unrelenting hunger to guard Dracomire's wealth. At first, the spell seemed to work. The crops doubled in size, the game in the forest multiplied, and the river yielded more fish than ever before. But the entity, bound by blood, soon revealed its true nature. It demanded more sacrifices, and when the villagers refused, it turned its wrath upon them. The first victims were found mutilated, their bodies drained of blood and their faces twisted in eternal screams. The villagers' attempts to banish the creature failed, and the witches vanished, leaving behind only the curse that bound the creature to Velka and Dracomire. The curse lingered for centuries. Dracomire's population dwindled as people either fled or succumbed to the creature's predations. Those who remained were the descendants of the original pact makers, bound to the land and the monster by blood. Over time, the villagers developed a series of rituals to appease the creature. They would leave offerings at the edge of the forest, carefully arranged on stone altars etched with protective symbols. Livestock, such as goats and chickens, were tied to stakes with red ribbons, believed to distract the creature's hunger. Trinkets made of silver and bone, materials thought to repel dark entities, were hung from the branches of trees, their clinking in the wind said to ward off its approach. The villagers would gather on nights of the new moon to chant old invocations around a sacred fire, their voices trembling with both reverence and fear. These rituals were shaped by their belief that the creature's wrath could be soothed with displays of submission. though deep down, many suspected that nothing could truly satisfy its insatiable hunger. They would leave offerings at the edge of the forest, livestock, trinkets, even carefully inscribed charms. But these offerings only seemed to delay the inevitable. One moonless night, the silence of Dracomir was shattered by the wail. It started as a low, guttural growl and rose into a piercing scream that seemed to shake the very earth. Edgar, the village's grizzled hunter, recognized the sound immediately. He had encountered the creature once before in his youth and had barely escaped with his life. Gathering the villagers in the chapel, Edgar declared that they could no longer live in fear. "This thing is part of us," Edgar said, his voice firm. "It comes for what we owe, but perhaps it can be undone." Edgar had spent years collecting fragments of the old witch's lore, and he believed there was a way to sever the blood pact and banish the creature. But it would require venturing into the heart of Velka, the creature's lair. The group that ventured into Velka was small but determined. Edgar, the grizzled hunter, was driven by a personal vendetta. The creature had killed his younger brother decades ago, leaving Edgar with an unrelenting need for justice. Mira, a young herbalist, carried the weight of her family's legacy. Her grandmother had been one of the last to study the old rituals, and Mira believed it was her duty to wield that knowledge. Alden, the blacksmith, joined out of loyalty to Edgar, who had once saved him from a fatal bear attack in the woods. Lastly, there was Lorna, the weaver, who harbored a secret. Her ancestors had been among those who forged the blood pact, and she saw this as her only chance to atone for her family's sins. Together, they carried their fears and hopes into the cursed forest, each step heavier with the weight of their personal stakes. Edgar led the way, accompanied by Mira, a young herbalist who had inherited her grandmother's knowledge of protective charms, and two others, Alden, the blacksmith, whose strength was unmatched, and Lorna, a weaver with a knack for deciphering ancient symbols. The forest was no ordinary place. As the group entered, the air grew colder, and an unnatural darkness enveloped them, muffling even their footsteps. The trees seemed alive, their branches twisting and groaning as if trying to grab at the intruders. Strange, echoing noises surrounded them, whispers that seemed to come from just beyond the edge of sight. Mira scattered protective herbs as they walked, muttering incantations under her breath. "This place remembers," she whispered. "It hates us." Hours passed, and the group stumbled upon signs of the creature's presence. Claw marks gouged deep into tree trunks, pools of coagulated blood, and piles of bones stripped clean. The wail came again, closer this time, and the air seemed to vibrate with its intensity. Edgar signaled for the group to press on, though his knuckles were white as he gripped his spear. At the forest's heart lay a clearing dominated by a massive ancient tree, its skeletal branches clawing at the sky as though in perpetual agony. The air in the clearing was thick and oppressive, carrying the faint metallic tang of blood. Wisps of mist clung to the ground, swirling unnaturally around the tree's gnarled roots, which spread out like the fingers of a grasping hand. The bark was blackened and cracked, oozing a dark, tar-like substance that dripped slowly into small pools below. Strange sigils carved into the trunk glowed faintly with a sickly red light, pulsating like a heartbeat. The atmosphere seemed alive, charged with a sinister energy that made the group's skin crawl, as if the very ground beneath them was watching, waiting. Its roots were gnarled and blackened, stretching out like skeletal fingers, and its trunk was carved with sigils that pulsed with a sickly red light. This was the place where the witches had performed their ritual centuries ago. At its base lay a stone altar, stained dark with the blood of countless sacrifices. As the group approached, the creature emerged from the shadows. It was more horrifying than any of them had imagined. Its gaunt frame was covered in taut, translucent skin, through which veins pulsed with black ichor. Its gaping maw was lined with jagged teeth, and its eyeless sockets radiated a malevolent hunger. The wail it emitted was deafening, and the group fell to their knees, clutching their ears. Mira, recovering first, began to chant. She held aloft a talisman carved from bone and inscribed with runes, the only artifact left behind by the witches. The creature recoiled, its movements jerky and unnatural, but it did not retreat. Instead, it lunged toward the group, its claws slicing through the air. Edgar and Alden fought desperately to hold the creature at bay, while Mira and Lorna worked to complete the banishment ritual. Mira's voice grew louder, her chants merging with the howling wind that had begun to whip through the clearing. Lorna traced the runes on the altar with trembling fingers, her mind racing to recall the symbols from the fragments Edgar had shown her. The creature's wail turned into a guttural growl as Edgar drove his spear into its chest. Black ichor sprayed forth, sizzling as it hit the ground, but the wound only seemed to enrage it. The creature swatted Edgar aside, sending him crashing into the altar. "It's not enough," Mira screamed. "We need more blood." Without hesitation, Edgar sliced his palm and pressed it to the altar. The runes flared brighter, and the creature shrieked, its form beginning to distort. But it was not finished. With a final, desperate lunge, it wrapped its claws around Edgar, dragging him toward its gaping maw. In a moment of clarity, Edgar shouted to the others, "Finish it! Do not stop, no matter what happens to me." Mira and Lorna obeyed, their voices rising in unison as they completed the ritual. The runes on the altar blazed with light, and the tree's roots began to writhe, pulling the creature back toward the ground. Edgar's screams mingled with the creature's as both were consumed in a vortex of light and shadow. When the light faded, the clearing was silent. The altar had crumbled to dust, and the tree's roots lay still. Of the creature and Edgar, there was no trace. Mira and Lorna returned to Drakemere as the sun rose, their faces pale and their spirits heavy. The villagers gathered in the square, their anxious faces turning hopeful at the sight of the women. Though Mira and Lorna bore the weight of their loss, they recounted the events with quiet dignity, sparing no detail of Edgar's sacrifice. To honor his memory, the villagers erected a stone cairn at the edge of the forest, inscribed with his name and the words, "He gave his blood to break the curse." In the weeks that followed, the village held a somber festival of remembrance. Lanterns carved with Edgar's likeness were lit and floated down the Blackmore River, symbolizing the hope that his spirit would guide and protect them. Mira took to tending the shrine daily, ensuring it remained a place of reverence and reflection. Lorna, meanwhile, began weaving intricate tapestries depicting Edgar's bravery, ensuring that his story would be passed down to future generations. Though the forest grew quiet and the wail was heard no more, the shadow of that night remained etched into Dracomere's soul, a reminder that the peace they now enjoyed had come at a terrible price. The villagers greeted them with hope, but the women could not bring themselves to celebrate. They had succeeded in banishing the creature, but at a terrible cost. In the years that followed, the village slowly began to recover. The forest of Velka grew quiet, and the wail was heard no more. Yet the memory of that night lingered, a shadow over Dracomere's soul. Some claimed to see Edgar's figure in the woods, watching over the village, while others swore they heard faint whispers on the wind, a warning that the curse could never truly be broken. And on moonless nights, when the air grows still and the mist thickens, the villagers light their lanterns and stay indoors, for fear that the bloodthirsty wail might one day return. Story 9. The Golden-Eyed Demon of Ebonshade. Nestled deep in a shadowed valley, veiled by an eternal mist, The village of Ebonshade was a place where fear clung to every corner. Surrounded by the foreboding Velka forest, its gnarled trees whispering ancient secrets, and bordered by the lifeless Blackmore River, the villagers lived under the suffocating weight of an old and terrible legend, the golden-eyed demon. This was no ordinary story meant to frighten children into obedience. It was a reality etched into the collective memory of Ebonshade. Generations had passed since the demon's wrath first swept through the village, but the scars remained, both in their crumbling homes and in their haunted eyes. The demon's name was Selena, a woman cursed by betrayal, who returned as a monstrous revenant with golden eyes that burned like hellfire and a wail that pierced the soul. Those who heard it never lived to speak of its horror. Ebonshade had not always been a village of fear. Centuries ago, it thrived as a bustling settlement, rich in resources and culture. The townsfolk celebrated their prosperity with grand festivals, lighting lanterns that floated high into the sky and sharing songs that echoed through the valley. Among them lived Celine, a strikingly beautiful woman with raven black hair and an air of mystery that captivated all who saw her. Yet, she was more than her beauty. She was a healer, an herbalist, and some whispered, a witch. Celine's life took a tragic turn when she fell in love with Gareth, a dashing hunter known for his charm and strength. Their love was passionate, but it was fleeting. Gareth's attention soon turned to Amara, the daughter of a wealthy merchant. The betrayal shattered Celine, but the worst came when the villagers turned against her, blaming her for the sudden deaths of livestock and the withering of crops that plagued Ebonshade that year. In her despair, Celine sought solace in the heart of Velka Forest, where she stumbled upon a coven of witches. Consumed by a desire for revenge, she begged them to grant her the power to punish those who had wronged her. The witches obliged, performing a dark ritual that transformed Selena into something inhuman. Her once beautiful face twisted into a mask of vengeance. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural golden light, and her voice became a wail so terrifying that it could shatter the strongest of minds. When Celine returned to Ebonshade, it was not as a woman, but as a force of destruction. She unleashed her fury upon the village, sparing no one. Not Gareth, not Amara, not even the children. The villagers, in a final act of desperation, captured her and burned her at the stake on a hill overlooking the village. As the flames consumed her, Celine uttered a chilling curse. I will return, and you will all pay in blood. For decades, Ebonshade lived in uneasy peace. The villagers avoided the hill where Celine had been executed, now overgrown with brambles and ominously silent. But one moonless night, under a blood-red sky, the curse awakened. The first sign was a scream that echoed through the village, a sound so piercing that it shattered windows and left the livestock trembling in their pens. When dawn broke, the body of a young woman was found in the village square, her eyes gouged out and her mouth frozen in a silent scream. Above her, scrawled in blood on the wall of the chapel, were the words, "She is here." Panic spread like wildfire. Each night brought new horrors. Villagers disappearing without a trace, their mutilated bodies found hanging from the trees of Velka Forest, shadows that moved on their own, and the unmistakable glow of golden eyes watching from the darkness. The villagers whispered her name in terror, knowing the demon they had created had returned to claim her revenge. In their desperation, the villagers turned to Father Elias, a priest known for his knowledge of the occult. Elias was no stranger to tales of vengeful spirits, and he believed that Selene could be banished. To defeat her, we must confront her where she was cursed, he declared. But it will require great sacrifice. A small group of volunteers stepped forward to face the demon. Leading them was Edgar, a grizzled hunter who had lost his son to Selene's wrath. Alongside him were Clara, a descendant of Amara who carried the guilt of her ancestors' betrayal. Alden, the village's blacksmith, whose strength was unmatched. and Mira, an apprentice herbalist armed with ancient charms passed down from her grandmother. The group prepared for their journey with grim determination. Father Elias armed them with blessed weapons and a sacred talisman said to disrupt dark magic. The talisman must be placed on her altar, he warned. Only then can her soul be severed from this world. The trek into Velka Forest was a descent into madness. The air grew colder with every step, and an unnatural darkness enveloped the group. The trees seemed to close in around them, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Whispers echoed through the air, growing louder as they pressed on, and strange symbols began to appear on the ground, glowing faintly in the dim light. The first attack came suddenly. A shadowy figure lunged at them from the darkness, its golden eyes glowing with malice. Edgar fired his crossbow, the bolt striking the figure and causing it to dissolve into ash. But the attack had shaken them, and they knew they were being hunted. At the forest's heart, they found the altar, a crumbling stone platform covered in moss and bloodstains, surrounded by brambles that pulsed as if alive. Standing atop the altar was Celine, her form more monstrous than any of them had imagined. Her once beautiful face was now a grotesque mask of vengeance, her golden eyes burning with hatred, and her voice, when she spoke, was a guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. "You dare enter my domain?" she hissed. "You will pay for the sins of your ancestors." Celine raised her arms, and the brambles came alive, lashing out at the group. Edgar and Alden fought desperately to hold them off, while Clara and Mira worked to place the talisman on the altar. Celine's wail pierced the air, causing the ground to shake and the group to falter. In the chaos, Celine targeted Clara, her rage focused on the descendant of the woman who had betrayed her. As Celine lunged, Edgar threw himself in her path, driving a silver dagger into her side. "Finish it!" he shouted as Celine's claws tore into him. With tears streaming down her face, Clara placed the talisman on the altar and began reciting the incantation Father Elias had taught her. The talisman glowed with a blinding light, and Celine let out a scream that echoed through the forest. Her body convulsed, the golden light in her eyes flickering and fading as the altar crumbled beneath her. When the light faded, Celine was gone, and the forest fell silent. Edgar's lifeless body lay at the base of the altar, his sacrifice ensuring the demon's defeat. The group returned to Ebonshade, carrying the weight of their loss and the hope that the curse had finally been lifted. The villagers built a memorial on the hill where Celine had been burned, not to honor her vengeance, but to remember the cost of their ancestors' sins. They inscribed it with the words, "Here lies the burden of betrayal." But Ebonshade would never truly be free. On moonless nights, some claimed to see golden eyes watching from the edge of the forest, and whispers of a wail carried on the wind served as a chilling reminder that curses, like wounds, never fully heal. Story 10. The Crimson Nun. A Tale of Eternal Terror. In the desolate village of Thorn Hollow, whispers of a haunting echoed through every shadowed corner. Tucked away in a forgotten valley surrounded by impenetrable woods, Thorn Hollow had long been forsaken by the outside world. Its roads, once bustling with merchants and travelers, had eroded into trails consumed by brambles and darkness. The village's most prominent landmark was the Abbey of St. Alara, a crumbling structure perched on the hilltop, its bell tower looming like a watchful eye. To the villagers, the abbey symbolized more than their faith. It was the source of their greatest fear, the cursed legend of the Crimson Nun. Decades ago, the abbey had been a sanctuary of peace and devotion. The nuns who resided within its stone walls were renowned for their compassion, particularly their leader, Sister Muriel. Known for her pale beauty and unwavering piety, Muriel was revered as a saint by the people of Thornhollow. She tended to the sick, fed the hungry, and led prayers that seemed to soothe even the harshest of fates. But beneath her serene exterior lay secrets that would doom the village for generations. It was a time of great hardship. Crops failed, the livestock fell ill, and a strange malaise crept through Thornhollow. The villagers begged the abbey for aid, overwhelmed by weeks of relentless hardship. Their cries echoed through the cold stone halls, each plea filled with desperation. Crops had withered under an unrelenting blight, livestock perished mysteriously, and a creeping sickness claimed lives with each passing day. Mothers wept for their dying children, while fathers cursed the heavens for their misfortune. Muriel, torn between her duty to God and her love for her people, felt the weight of their suffering crushing her soul. Convinced that divine intervention would not come in time, she turned to the abbey's catacombs, where ancient tomes of forbidden knowledge lay hidden. Driven by a hope born of despair, she broke the seals on the sacred chest, her trembling hands brushing against the cursed pages of a tome that whispered promises of salvation in exchange for sacrifice. Hidden in the abbey's catacombs was a tome of dark rituals, sealed away centuries ago by the church. Muriel, in her desperation, broke the seals and studied its cursed pages. She discovered a ritual that promised prosperity and health, but at a terrible cost: blood. On a moonless night, Muriel performed the ritual in secret. She spilled her own blood onto the altar, invoking the presence of a being she could barely comprehend. In exchange for her sacrifice, the village flourished. The fields turned green, the rivers teemed with fish, and the sickness vanished. But the pact was far from benevolent. Muriel's body began to change. Her once bright eyes turned crimson, her skin grew pale as death, and she hungered for more blood to sustain the power she had unleashed. The villagers, unaware of her sacrifice, celebrated their sudden fortune. But when livestock and eventually people began to disappear, suspicion turned toward the abbey. One fateful night, a group of villagers stormed the abbey, discovering the blood-stained altar and the monstrous figure that Muriel had become. Horrified, they bound her to the cross at the center of the chapel and set her ablaze. As the flames consumed her, Muriel's voice rose above the crackling fire, a curse etched into every heart present. "I will rise again. My blood will stain this land until the end of time." For years after Muriel's death, Thornhollow languished. The abbey fell into ruin, and the village's prosperity withered. The people whispered of shadows in the forest, of a mournful bell tolling in the dead of night, and of blood-red eyes watching from the darkness. But the true horror began decades later, when the bell of Saint Alara rang for the first time in 50 years. It was a stormy night, and the village was shrouded in mist. The bell's chime echoed through the valley, a low, mournful sound that froze the blood of all who heard it. When the villagers gathered in the square, they saw her, a figure draped in a tattered habit, her face pale and streaked with blood, a twisted crown of iron pressed against her skull. Her eyes glowed crimson, and her lips parted to reveal jagged teeth. The crimson nun had returned. Her wail split the air, a sound so terrible that it shattered windows and drove the bravest men to their knees. That night, the first victim was found, the village blacksmith, his body hanging from the church rafters, his eyes gouged out, and the symbol of the abbey carved into his chest. Above him, written in blood on the wall, were the words, "Her will be done." Each night, the Crimson Nun claimed another victim. The villagers lived in constant terror, their nerves fraying with each passing hour. Families huddled together in their homes, clutching rosaries and muttering prayers as if the words alone could keep her at bay. The air grew heavy with despair, and the night seemed to stretch endlessly, filled with the echoes of her mournful wail. Parents took turns keeping watch over their children, their hands trembling as they gripped crude weapons fashioned from farm tools. Some villagers grew paranoid, accusing their neighbors of summoning her wrath, while others sank into a catatonic silence, their minds broken by the fear of her crimson eyes appearing in their windows. The smell of burnt offerings filled the village square as desperate attempts to appease her grew more frequent. But nothing seemed to stop the relentless tolling of the abbey bell, signaling another soul claimed by her vengeance. Some were found torn apart in their homes. Others vanished into the forest, their bodies never recovered. The villagers' fear turned to desperation. They barricaded their doors, hung crucifixes in their windows, and refused to speak her name. But nothing stopped her. The bell rang every night, heralding another death, and the abbey became a beacon of dread, its ruined walls glowing faintly under the crimson moon. Father Alric, the village priest, believed there was a way to banish her. The curse was born in the abbey, he told the terrified villagers. It is there that it must end. A group of 5 villagers volunteered to accompany Father Alric to the abbey. Among them was Edgar, a grizzled hunter whose daughter had been taken; Clara, a young woman haunted by visions of the nun; Alden, the blacksmith's apprentice seeking vengeance for his master; and Mira, a healer armed with ancient charms passed down by her grandmother. Together, they climbed the hill under the blood-red moon, their torches flickering in the wind. The abbey was a place of nightmares. Its walls were covered in dark, pulsating sigils that seemed to writhe and shift when stared at too long, as though alive. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a cloying mixture of rotting wood and dried blood that clung to the back of the throat. Faint whispers echoed through the halls, though no one could pinpoint their source, and footsteps that didn't belong to the group seemed to follow them at every turn. Dust-covered relics were scattered across the floor, their once holy symbols defiled with claw marks and dripping with a viscous black substance. The torches cast flickering shadows on the walls, and every so often, those shadows appeared to move of their own accord, reaching out with ghostly fingers as if trying to ensnare the intruders. The atmosphere pressed down on them like a physical weight, sapping their courage with each step. Shadows moved where no light fell, and whispers seemed to emanate from the very stones. At the center of the chapel stood the altar where Miriel had performed the ritual, now cracked and oozing a dark, viscous fluid. Above it, the iron cross where she had burned still stood, its edges jagged and rusted with blood. As the group entered, the bell tolled, and the crimson nun emerged from the shadows. Her voice was a guttural rasp, filled with malice. "You dare enter my sanctuary?" she hissed. "Your blood will feed my return." The air grew heavy as the nun raised her arms, and the sigils on the walls flared to life. Shadows coalesced into monstrous shapes, attacking the group with claws and teeth. Edgar fired his crossbow, but the bolts passed through the creatures as if they were smoke. Mira scattered her charms, creating a protective circle around the group, while Father Alric began to chant an exorcism. The nun's wail filled the chapel, a sound that shook the very foundation of the building. The group fell to their knees, clutching their ears as the horrific noise seemed to pierce directly into their skulls. Clara's vision blurred, tears streaming down her face as the vibrations rattled her bones. Alden dropped his blade, his hands trembling uncontrollably, while Mira gasped for breath, her charms slipping from her grasp. Edgar, the grizzled hunter, tried to shout commands, but his voice was drowned in the deafening cacophony. The very air around them felt alive, pulsing with malevolent energy, as if the wail were tearing the fabric of reality itself. Shadows flickered wildly on the walls, and the sigils glowed brighter, throbbing in time with the unholy sound, threatening to overwhelm their resolve entirely. Clara, clutching a sacred relic, a shard of the original altar, moved toward the Crimson Nun. "This is where it ends," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. With a scream of rage, the nun lunged at Clara, but Alden intercepted her, driving a silver blade into her side. The nun shrieked, her form flickering like a dying flame, but she was not defeated. "You cannot destroy what you created," she roared, her crimson eyes blazing. Realizing what must be done, Father Alric took the relic from Clara and placed it on the altar. "Blood bound this curse," he said, "and blood must break it." He drew a dagger and cut his palm, letting his blood drip onto the relic. The sigils on the walls began to fade, and the nun's wail turned to a howl of agony. "No!" she screamed, her body disintegrating into ash. "You cannot banish me. I will return. I will always return." As the last of her form vanished, the chapel collapsed, burying the altar and the relic beneath the rubble. The surviving villagers emerged into the night, battered but alive. Thornhollow was free, but at a cost. Father Alric had perished in the ritual, his body found kneeling before the altar, clutching the relic that had sealed the Crimson Nun's fate. The survivors bore the scars of their ordeal, both physical and emotional. Clara, her hair now streaked with white, refused to speak of what she had seen during the final moments of the battle. Alden carried a limp from injuries sustained in the abbey, but he found solace in crafting a memorial to Father Alric in the village square, forging a statue that depicted the priest as a guardian standing watch over Thornhollow. The villagers gathered to rebuild their lives, but the memory of the Crimson Nun lingered in every shadow. They spoke in hushed tones of the horrors they had endured, and some planted wildflowers at the base of the hill leading to the abbey, believing they could purify the cursed ground. Yet on stormy nights, when the wind howled through the valley, the bell of Saint Ilara could still be heard faintly, its mournful toll a chilling reminder. Clara often stood at her window on these nights, clutching the cross she had carried into the abbey, and prayed that the nun's curse would never rise again. The abbey was sealed, its ruins left to crumble into the earth. Yet, on stormy nights, the bell of Saint Ilara could still be heard, its mournful toll a reminder of the Crimson Nun's curse. And in the darkest corners of Thornhollow, some claimed to see her, a figure in a tattered habit, her crimson eyes glowing in the shadows, waiting for the day when she would rise again.